Hi, my name is Jack Sen. I'm the founder of the British Renaissance Policy Institute. This is part of a series of films my organisation will be producing, documenting the work of British nationalists. Work that's been omitted from the annals of British history by a corrupt anti-English establishment. My foray into British politics started while sitting on my wife's family farm in Lapland, northernmost Sweden, nearly a decade ago. Although under various pseudonyms, I've been blogging about Zionism, Marxism, and general politics off and on since university, as well as running several high-traffic websites and Facebook community pages. It wasn't until I began researching how wretched Britain had become that I decided I wanted to return to England, get involved with politics, and ultimately run for office. Knowing that my granddad's local pub had been turned into a Baltic food shop, and the old Skem town hall now held weekly Islamic Jummahs on council tax revenue, drove me ballistic. I'd heard Britain had changed since the summers I'd spent in Lancashire as a child, but never in my wildest nightmares could I have envisaged the carnage that had been unleashed upon my beloved ancestral homeland by Britain's traitorous politicians. As people watching this film will probably already know, Sweden itself is a product of the same sort of diabolical madness Britain's been infected with. However, due to the fact that the region I was living in is about as populated as the Shetland Islands, and closer to the North Pole than Somalia, I don't experience much of what afflicts Britain firsthand, myself. In fact, I had no idea how bad things had become. But by the internet and weekly chats with friends and family back in the UK, I learned Britain was facing a serious dilemma. So I blogged, read, and ultimately watched a decade's worth of hard talk, panorama, and question time episodes in the process, all without having to pay the Marxist buggers a penny in license fees. It was at this point I first encountered Nick Griffin. The question time Nick appeared on in September of 2009 was a watershed moment for me. The appalling manner in which he and each and every person that had voted for him at the 2000 European election, every last person that still believes in our democratic process, had been treated by that broadcast, and the brutal realization that the true patriots would never ever receive a fair shake in this country, regardless of their efforts to placate the establishment, shocked me to my core. It, along with the realization the nation I'd loved as a child was all but lost, would propel me back to Britain from my frosty cabin on the 64th parallel. I would ultimately get involved in British politics myself, first joining UKIP and running for Parliament before my run-in with Zionists, Luciana Berger and Nigel Farage, and then serving the BNP as a party spokesman and officer. So it's as if I'm coming full circle today via this interview. Although Nick wrote a chapter in my recent book, and in spite of the blatantly false rumours that he and I conspired to take down current BNP leadership, I'll be honest, I don't know the former member of European Parliament all that well. One thing I do know, though, is that he has been unfairly judged, not for his actions, a subject I know very little about, but as a person and nationalist. Like it or not, it must not have been easy being Nick Griffin during the BNP's rise to prominence. Although the former BNP leader stewarded his party to the greatest electoral success any British nationalist party has ever achieved, Nick was brutalised in the press, vilified for things he never said, mistakes he never made, and a worldview most decent people that genuinely love this country now prescribe to. The media unfairly treated Nick to a far greater degree than they have any single other politician this nation has ever seen. More than actual villains. Greville Janner, Luciana Berger, Tony Blair come to mind. Nick might not be perfect and undoubtedly has made errors along the way, as we all do. However, without a shadow of a doubt, he has been judged unfairly. My hope is that after this broadcast, that will change. Today, Nick and I will be covering a variety of topics, as well as discussing his most recent writings, feelings, legacy, and Weltanschauung. From his appearance on Question Time and the manner in which he and his fellow nationalists were treated by the establishment during his tenure in Brussels, his thoughts on the rise of UKIP, the destabilization of Syria, Jewish involvement in the English Defence League, Pegida and other kosher nationalist organizations, the rise of UKIP, the disturbing infiltration of both American and British nationalism by hyper-aggressive homosexual males and their Zionist stooge counterparts, men like Greg Johnson, Jared Taylor, Richard Spencer, Max Muson, Matthew Tate, to his catastrophic decision to involve people like Patrick Harrington, Adam Walker, and Clive Jefferson into the BNP. Nothing will be off limits. It should be a really interesting afternoon. Hi, Nick. Good to see you.
Hi.
It's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you.
Interesting, before we started filming, you and I discussed how, well, I say after you, I was probably the last person to host a BNP TV weekly program. Mm-hmm. And during one of the episodes, we discussed, future possibilities. And one was my cooking a chicken and seeing how many meals I could pull out of one chicken for, members of the the public that aren't that well-to-do. And he said you could cook 20-odd meals out of one chicken.
I think that was out of a big chicken, to be fair.
Was it?
That was 20, not different meals, but 20 different portions.
20 different portions.
Starting with a roast dinner and so on, then going on to the cold stuff with jacket potatoes, then ending up with the soup and so on. You can do that twice if you boil it up, if you're really mean, and so on. Yeah, we got 20 portions. We could get 20 portions out of a big chicken.
Did you film that?
We didn't film that. No, we didn't get around to that one. We did one with a stew and so on and so forth. Got quite a lot of publicity, actually. Also, jokes from the left. It did work quite well. But the one we were going to do, I should still like to do, really, is to do a chicken curry. Various of the hardliners are saying, oh, you can't have curry, this foreign market. Like, no, it's the most popular dish in Britain, basically, or sort of on a par with fish and chips. And if we can't cook it ourselves, we've got to import the chefs. So I was going to cook it on the basis of, there it is and so on. And basically, we got the recipe. Now F off.
Yeah. And it's an empirical dish. It's from the empire. So it's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there will be, it makes the cuisine spicier if you have different elements from other countries. There's nothing wrong with that.
It's like, we have in Britain, in London and so on, there's Mexican restaurants.
Yeah.
But Britain isn't awash with Mexicans.
Exactly. And it's something I stated when someone asked me. I said, cities will have an international flavor.
Yeah.
There will be foreign restaurants and there will be foreign people. But the problem is when you have those foreign people taking over the entire city and it loses its British, well, it should be a British culture. It should be based on British culture. And I mean, I don't know what percentage, how many foreigners should be in the country where it shouldn't be in the country, where it starts to change. But certainly, there's a huge difference between having a couple of restaurants with people working and owning them than having tens of millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people coming in to work as migrant labourers.
I think the point at which it should stop in a proper society is where the indigenous people say enough's enough. When there's a free and fair, open position in terms of ownership of the media and the way the political system's run, if the indigenous people are happy with a certain degree of enrichment, then no political force can stop them, even if the ideologically pure want them to. But there's nowhere in the Western world where we've reached the stage where the indigenous have been allowed to say enough is enough. It's all been steamrolled over by the elite, and that's the key problem.
Yeah, precisely. And at the end of the day, when people come to the country to open restaurants or come to work in restaurants, they can apply for visas for that. They should be coming in en masse into the country, hundreds of thousands of people. It's quite simple to file an application and say, I have X amount of pounds to purchase a property, to build a restaurant. I will be bringing in 6 or 7 of my friends to help work in the restaurant. And I will have it in an area where you need a restaurant. That's a little different than saying, well, hundreds of thousands are coming in, no skills, no ability to do work, to fill jobs that you don't have, to drive up the price of your housing. It's very different.
One is business, and the other is colonisation.
So
big
precisely. And then, when I was in London, I recognised there were quite a few wealthy Arabs where I used to work, and people would complain about them, and I would say, well, they invested a lot of money here. They're not the problem. It's when you go to East London and you don't see it, you don't see the Latin alphabet anywhere.
Yes,
it's all in Arabic. These people just transform the entire area to their own. So you have a situation, obviously, where the people from the third world bring the third world to Britain. It doesn't work. No. It just doesn't work. Before I begin, I would like to say a special thanks and hello to Jason Clark, the former Deputy Director of the American Freedom Party and British Renaissance board member, without whose support literally none of our projects could happen. Right after his speaking at the NPD conference in Germany, Jason fell gravely ill. He wanted to be here with us today. He had a heart attack. He was with Matthew Heimbach in Germany. And he was supposed to come be with us here today, but he wasn't able to make it because his health has taken a little bit of a turn for the worse.
Good to hear.
But he's on the mend, we hope. His love for Britain is quite strong, and I want to thank him. Okay, so I suppose the first question would be, why do you think people are still so keen on hearing what you have to say, especially in the United States? Seems a bit...
well, I don't know if they are. You said they are.
Well, they are. So why would you think?
Right, I guess it's because Britain still has, especially in the Anglo-speaking world, but elsewhere as well, Britain still has a certain sort of image of an important power in various ways, way above the reality. So that's important. And what we did with the British National Party in Britain was truly remarkable in that we made serious political breakthroughs in a first-past-the-post system with an extraordinarily tightly controlled mass media in the teeth of just horrendous opposition. There's literally none of the European parties at any level who made their breakthroughs in a system as difficult as the British system. So I think what we achieved was fairly remarkable.
It was.
We achieved it in what is basically the universal language. We'll talk later on about the Alliance for Peace and Freedom aspect, the nationalists that I work with. And our meetings, we always joke, we say, well, ideally we conduct the meeting in Latin, but we're several hundred years or several thousand years too late for that, or 1,000 years too late for that, so therefore we'll conduct it in English.
Yeah.
So what happens in the English language, simply because other people can assimilate it much more easily, tends to be really, really important for large parts of the rest of the world. I think that's all really it is.
And Russia and China, they teach English now as the second language for both
Indeed,
those nations.
yeah.
I mean, they haven't chosen French, or the Chinese haven't chosen Japanese. Business schools, they all teach
English.
Yeah. So it makes perfect sense.
It makes it very much easier for us, doesn't
It does. Much to the chagrin of probably the French audience.
Yes.
But life goes on. Well, I'll tell you that, one of the things that people always bring up when I speak to them is your appearance at Question Time, especially the Americans, because obviously they don't follow. They have C-SPAN. They watch Senate hearings.
Yeah.
They don't follow the European Union debates or hearings, but they do follow the BBC, unfortunately. So what they see on the BBC is what they get. So, the idea of this particular program came from your well-publicized experiences dealing with the BBC, moments etched indelibly in all of our collective memories. There was a Question Time in 2009, I referenced in the intro and now, where you appeared with a real motley crew of left-wing zealots, Blair minister and Zionist supremacist Jack Straw, Black American curator at the British Museum, as well as a Muslim extremist, Baroness Warsi, I think it was. Yeah. Did you know in advance who you'd be sitting alongside, and did you envisage they'd be as hostile as they were?
I didn't know who it was going to be. I think we'd heard that it was going to be Straw, but we didn't know who the others were. It was very much sort of kept under wraps. Obviously, I expected hostility, but several things. First of all, I looked at what they'd done when Jerry Adams first appeared on Question Time for Sinn Féin, and basically they sort of asked him the first question, well, have you agreed to stop killing people? And he answered that. And then they moved on to do a normal Question Time, which was to discuss, transport, the health service, just current issues of that week. So I perhaps rather naively assumed that they'd asked me several questions of the "have you stopped beating your wife" type level, and then we'd move on. I didn't expect a programme which was not a Question Time at all. For the first time, they said afterwards, for the first time in I think it's 32 years, they moved away from the normal way of working and just made it about me and the BNP. And looking at it afterwards, I realised what they'd done. It was very much done to a formula. The first part of it was designed to establish that I was a fascist, and then it was just the leftist mantra: fascist, racist, Islamophobic, homophobic. They dealt with that in the racism. They dealt with that in the fascist section, really. So even when they let me speak, for instance, about what I thought about Islam and so on, it was as a way to establish the fact in the eyes of the public that I'm Islamophobic. So it was a complete stitch up from start to finish.
Shameful.
I discussed with several people before how to handle it. And we decided that my normal style is very competitive. And we decided that if I did that, for instance, the first time when I was on a program called Hard Talk with Tim Sebastian.
We'll get into that.
We'll get into that one. That was basically just a knockdown, drag-em-out fighting match. Yeah. And it made terrible TV. It impressed nobody. We spoke to people afterwards, neither him nor me. So if I'd gone in on Question Time to replicate that, instead of a 1-to-1, it would have been a 4 or 5-to-1. And so it would have been a terrible piece of television which simply wouldn't have worked, and we think wouldn't have done us any good in any case. So it made the conscious and deliberate decision before the thing that I was going to go on television and get beaten up, which was why I was very laid back and at some points, frankly, poor by my normal style. It certainly disappointed some of our people, because when I've been in, for instance, with Jeremy Paxman, it's a toe-to-toe verbal boxing match, and it makes good TV.
It does.
But we simply decided to say we couldn't do that on Question Time, and I get beaten up on TV.
And he's fairer than people.
Actually, he's far fairer. We'll perhaps talk about him later. I think. But that was the plan. That's what I did. The point that people in the street still come up to me and say, "I love what you said about Jack Straw on Question Time."
That was great. That was
because that was the point at which I lost my temper, and that was me being natural.
I was going to ask you, do you regret not being more aggressive during the program?
I regret it now for a reason I'll come on to in a moment. But that was the plan, and that's what we did, and essentially it worked. And it did work, because although the various people, the various plants, agents and hostiles within the party and within the movement used it afterwards to say, oh, that was rubbish and Griffin's got to go and all the rest of it, what counts in these matters is the public. And the week before Question Time, the highest the British National Party had ever stood in the opinion polls was 6%. The week after, we were 23%.
Obviously.
That's what does it. Right. And what we decided was that the British people have this root for the underdog mentality, get beaten up on television, and that'll click. And with the combination of doing that, and also the fact that when the BBC let me run loose and say what I wanted about radical Islam for 3 or 4 minutes uninterrupted, in their eyes to establish me as an Islamophobe, what they didn't realise was that millions of ordinary people watching it, and it had an enormous audience.
It resonated with
three times the normal audience. It resonated with ordinary people. Yeah. And I think that's, and then you asked, do I regret how I handled that one? Well, yes, but for this reason, that the rules that the BBC were bound by at that time were such that they still owe me 12 Question Time appearances, because we should have had 2 per year after that. So we expected that they would, having agreed to have me on once, if they'd not let me on at all, we'd think, well, they're not going to stick to the rules at all. When they had me on once, we thought that's a first time.
I see.
And they'll have me back again. And then in subsequent times, I can talk about the normal things and also be more aggressive and so on. So it's a shame personally that only got the one
opportunity and you didn't
seize it. And I didn't seize it. But had I seized it, and we'd had a knockdown, the public would have seen, well, he's a nasty man, they're all arguing. It's the same, all politicians, they're all the bloody same, bang, and it did make that difference. But of course, as it then wasn't sustained, and I think there's something very important happened with the BBC after that. They clearly believed that this racist, fascist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, homophobic mantra would do the job and would horrify the British public. And clearly when they saw that 23% following week, at that point they made a very difficult decision. Never have him on the BBC or anywhere ever again, unless you absolutely have to, which is just at election times. And it was a major point at which they simply started to freeze us out. And then at the same time, ruthlessly promoting Nigel Farage, whereas they owe me 12 Question Time appearances. Farage has been on more than anybody else in British politics ever.
I was going to say that. He's had the 13.
So he had mine.
He had your
yes.
13.
Yeah, sure. And that really is the long and the short of the Question Time thing.
Did it affect you on a personal level? I mean, in your confidence and how you perceive the public?
It sent my recognition factor even further. Sure. Yeah, higher, which is good, but personally, and especially with the family and so on, a pain, because you can't go anywhere, or certainly couldn't. It's still the case to an extent, but it's much less so now, without people wanting to stop and have a chat and have photographs and all the rest. Very, very rarely any trouble, but it's still intrusive from a family point of view. So the only thing I kicked myself for ages about was Bonnie Greer's quip, when she said, oh, but you only got a 2-2 at Cambridge. And I should have said yes, but that was in law and I got it in a year. Yep. How long did it take you to get your degree, Bonnie?
Probably through affirmative action.
Well, that's a very biased racist.
I'm sorry, I apologise for that.
But it will certainly have taken her 3 years, not 1 year, to get a proper degree. So I kicked myself for ages for not having made that point. But that's a very petty personal pride point. Other than that, it did the job.
I actually mentioned her in here. I kept thinking to myself how she was conspicuously disrespectful towards you, and I wondered if you'd. I kept on wanting to ask her myself, will you please, address Mr. Griffin? Mm-hmm. She never made eye contact.
Yeah, but
that was very rude.
It was very rude, but she was the only one who was remotely human. Because, of course, she could be, because, being of ethnicity, she could, very, very definitely so, she could talk to me without appearing to be a collaborator. So in the run-up and in the breaks and so on, she was happily chatting away.
I was just going to ask another question.
Whereas the others were... No, they put me separately. Everyone's normally in the green room. But they had a green room for me and a green room for the others.
Quarantine. Were they quarantining them or quarantine?
I was... I'm not sure about that.
Should be quarantined.
Yes, I'm not sure about that. But then I had... Dimbleby came in at one stage, and it was unfortunate timing. I just had in my hand a piece of stone as I was speaking to the security chaps with me. I said, what's that? You're going to throw it at someone? So I said, no, it's a piece of a gravestone from Manchester, which is a Manchester church which was turned into a mosque, and all the graves were smashed up. So I had this to use as a prop. And Dimbleby saw it, and immediately a security guard of theirs came and took it away from me. No props on here.
So Dimbleby was quite aggressive. He was
He was extremely dishonest because he came on. The others, expected. I got what I expected from them.
Yeah.
But Dimbleby came into the green room beforehand and said normal rules of engagement, this, that, and the other, how it works, and so on. Shook my hand. It's just normal. And then organised this stitch up. So again, I should at the end have said, well, you're a disgrace. Get to him. Because for the others, well, politicians are supposed to go and beat each other up.
Which is true.
But he's supposed to be an impartial chairman, and he most definitely wasn't.
Yeah, disappointing, but it's what I expected. To be honest with you. And to be honest with you, when you said Bonnie Greer was the most human, it doesn't surprise me either. She doesn't seem like a political animal.
No.
So
no.
I figured that Straw and Varsity would be particularly rude.
Yes.
And off-camera hostile.
Yes.
Just, quick story, I met Alan Johnson at a political dinner that he was at, and I was being promoted at, and he had no idea he was in UKIP. We had a great conversation for about 15 minutes, and then he asked me what I did. And I mentioned I'm running for Parliament, and he was like, "Oh, that's marvelous. Which party?" I said, "UKIP." And he literally turned to stone. He did not say goodbye, and he walked away.
Yeah.
And I was quite surprised because he was all smiles.
Yes.
We had a couple of drinks together, and he literally was just stone-faced, wouldn't look at me, and walked away. And this is UKIP.
Yes,
so I can imagine if I said the BNP,
yes. Yeah, sure.
it would have been probably call the armed guards to come and take
I
Jack
think
off.
with these people, there's a great deal of guilt.
Yeah.
Because they know that what they've done is terribly wrong. Yeah, I'm sure of it. Not all of them.
You think Alan Johnson thinks that? Because he seems quite
I don't know
still.
on an individual basis,
Okay.
but I would say a lot of them know that what they've done is terribly wrong, or at the very best, they're now unsure about it. They have no confidence in the thing they've created. They're very nervous about what happens next. So the likes of us make them very uncomfortable indeed.
Interesting. So anybody in particular you think it has been impacted by the change in the country? In the Labour Party, would you say? I know Mendelsohn has mentioned immigration, but he seems quite disingenuous. Anybody in the Labour Party?
Possibly the biggest surprise or the interest is Frank Field from Liverpool, just down the road, who unfortunately just really before the days of the internet, and I can't track it down anywhere, but I actually saw him say that there was a conspiracy to do away with the white race in Britain, in the Labour Party, in the early 60s, and he was part of it.
Interesting. Oh.
But now there's no trace of that anywhere, down the memory hole.
So you and I discussed your BBC Hard Talk interview with Tim Sebastian a few months back when we first communicated with one another. Let's see a clip.
Some of your positions are pretty offensive to Jews.
I don't think they are, but...
what, the denial of the Holocaust, for instance?
I don't deny the Holocaust.
You don't? What do you deny, then?
I deny that it's right. There's something that happened 60 years ago, which my father fought against, and many people in this country fought against, is used as a club with which to beat people, so that if you say, well, we think the multiracial society isn't working, oh, well, you're a Nazi, you want to gas people.
So you've changed your views about it, because your magazines have consistently called it a hollow hoax.
I've used the phrase once. It's not just people like the British National Party who've said that it's wrong that this should be used in modern politics.
No, but you've changed your view here, haven't you?
A lot of people have changed their views on this, yes.
So you now accept that the Holocaust took place?
I've never denied that there was a Holocaust, that large numbers of Jews perished just because they were Jews. There's no doubt about that.
You've said it was a conspiracy, a mixture of wartime Allied propaganda and all sorts of
There's a lot of propaganda in anything connected with war. The facts and fictions of the Second World War and the Holocaust are very confused. They're now being studied mainly by Jews, people like Norman Finkelstein.
Nobody's confused about the fact that 6 million Jews died. Countries all over the world have accepted it. There's a few dissidents on the side, and David Irving, who your party in the past has also supported, has been comprehensively rubbish, hasn't he?
There's Jewish academics like Norman Finkelstein, who...
You can always find a few dissident
He's recently published a book called The Holocaust Industry. Now, he's not denying, just as I'm not denying, that large numbers of Jews suffered and were murdered just because they were Jews.
6 million Jews in the gas chambers. You accept that now, do you?
There's no question that there was large numbers. I don't think anyone accepts 6 million. It's described in the Holocaust Museum in Yad Vashem as being symbolic.
In my opinion, the media, instead of allowing us to discuss the society-ravaging ideals the Jews are responsible for, the group evolutionary strategy, to use Dr. Kevin MacDonald's term, intentionally drag us back to the Holocaust in an attempt to deflect genuine criticism from organized Jewry. The Holocaust happened 80 years ago. In the meantime, Britain is dying. The cancer that is cultural Marxism is ravaging every less facet of our society, yet we're still talking about World War II. You made that point yourself. However, after recently watching Hard Talk, I thought you spoke too long on the Holocaust, and you defended yourself for too long. In total, it was 7 minutes of the 23-minute program was to discuss the Holocaust. Do you agree we need to move away from this sort of rhetoric? Do you think we should discuss it still? Do you regret discussing it to the extent you did with Tim Sebastian, or was it impossible to avoid the question?
I always find it difficult to regret being honest, because I prefer to be honest.
Yeah.
But after that, and again, talking to people on how it was received, we made a decision we'll simply avoid that where possible again. And various colleagues on the more liberal wing of the party urged me to simply surrender completely and go for the Wailing Wall and all the rest of it. And I said, no, I just want to ignore it.
In the BNP?
Yes, yeah.
Anybody in particular you could say?
Well, it's the Clive Jefferson sort of angle and so on, yes.
All the way to the Wailing Wall?
Yeah. It said if the Jews are that powerful, then we must work with them, have them on our side.
Is it because they think they will help them financially, or do you think it's because they think politically?
Mainly financial, but perhaps politically as well. Marine Le Pen made the same move and so on.
She's done well.
She's done well, although of course she still gets attacked by the same Zionist media in just the same way, and it is something of a dead end. Just coming on to that, thinking about the Tim Sebastian thing, if you also perhaps would like to play a clip of me on my second time with Jeremy Paxman in 2010, and he also tried to raise this when he said, well, so let's talk about the policy of the death penalty. And then he said, well, how would you do it with a gas chamber? So I just said, no.
I've seen that.
So I just said, no, that's the American way. and move swiftly on. But Paxman's a good example. He's obviously the most feared of the interviewers. The first time I was on with him was when I really was the first person to say this isn't an Asian problem, this is a Muslim problem, and a big effect in Britain, including particularly amongst the Sikhs, but elsewhere as well. That had a major effect, drawing that distinction. And at the end of that, that was in a remote studio where I was in Birmingham and he was in London. And at the end of that interview, the lights went out basically. I've still got the microphone in my ear, so I hear him down the line. He said, "Are you still there?" So I said, "Yes." So he said, "Well, what are you saying?" Because he'd said, "Who's really responsible?" So I said, "The media's responsible." This was in the context of the Oldham riots. And I'd said the media was mainly responsible for this massive trouble between the Muslim community and the local whites. He said, "What do you mean? That's rubbish." I said, "No, if you've got a moment, I'll explain." Obviously, the camera's off by now. So he said, "Yeah, okay, fire away." So I said, "Well, it's like this, that early in the year," this was 2001, early in the year, an old British Army veteran, Walter Chamberlain, had been badly beaten up by a couple of Muslim youths. And for once, it had really hit the press, a big issue. And the media had covered it. And as a result of that, 600-700 Stoke fans up at an Oldham game joined up with the Oldham fans, and they rampaged through one of the two Muslim areas with literally a pogrom. They smashed up every car, they smashed the windows of every house all the way down the street. And I said to Paxman, the thing is that the liberal media, that's you lot, you cover the one story, the white man getting attacked, but in order to pretend that multiculturalism was working fine, you didn't cover when the Asians were attacked. And as a result, the first story angered the whites, and your failure to cover the second story angered the Muslims. So you've now got whites and Muslims angry, and they kick off, bang, and that's it. So I said, "You're responsible for this." And he said, "That's bollocks. That's absolute fucking bollocks." His precise words.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. So we parted.
I didn't see that live.
No. Let's say the cameras were switched off by this stage. This was purely a one-to-one. But so we parted company on very bad terms in 2001. 2010, 9 years later, Paxman produced a very interesting book, basically about how the England that he loved, he's a keen fly fisherman and so on, is sort of fading away. He's clearly got the problem of Islamism, and in the second one, which was a live studio thing, when I was only on purely because they had to have me on under their rules in an election period, and we actually was sitting next to each other closer than this, and he was again quite aggressive and pushy, the Paxman that people are scared of, but that was a tremendous fun interview. in which I simply were boxing. He frankly didn't lay a glove on me. It was great fun. At the end of it, as I got up, he turned and he winked.
Oh, that's good.
So that was quite
It's
good.
nice to hear, actually.
Yes,
I mean, I'm not saying it's going to renew my faith in the BBC, but certainly I wouldn't say I'm a fan of Jeremy Paxman, but I do enjoy his work.
He's a serious big beast, whatever else you think of him.
Yeah,
Most of the rest.
I agree.
Sebastian's was just a loudmouth would-be bully.
I think he was removed from I've been told he was removed from the BBC for angering some Zionist rabbi.
Uh-huh.
That's what I was told. I don't know if it's true,
Could be.
but I ran these questions by one of my friends in the United States. He said he was quite sure that Sebastian had angered some rabbi about Israel, and he didn't last very long after that. What are your thoughts regarding nationalists today and their fixation on 1930s politics? Groups like National Action, even London Forum's Jez Turner, they seem quite fixated on the Jews to an extent that it seems to be harming our efforts, I think. That's my personal opinion.
I think it does. It's a sort of program for defeat. If you focus, whatever you focus your mind on consciously, the subconscious sort of tends to go along with it. So if you're focusing your conscious on Götterdämmerung and 1945 and the failure of Berlin, then to your subconscious it's fairly obvious that you want to go the same way. So it's very, very dangerous, that in any case. I can understand sort of where people come from, especially young people who are told, the only people who are wicked enough to stand up, to oppose what's being done, this wonderful society, are the Nazis. So a 17-year-old kid thinks, well, perhaps I'm a Nazi then. And
what about the adults behind the scenes?
The adults behind the scenes. Well, I've always been reminded of the thing that a long time ago, when I was in the USA, I met a chap, an old chap, even then, by the name of, I think it was Wes Hooker, probably long dead, but he'd been quite a close associate of George Lincoln Rockwell. And he said to me, and I've no reason to doubt it or disbelieve it, because he was thoroughly pro-Rockwell and so on. He said, it's a funny thing, Rockwell was quite open privately about receiving funds from some rabbi or whatever, a hardcore Zionist. And he'd said to Hooker, well, they want to give him the money, I'll take the money. And they want it just because they want to be to scare the little Jews, basically into either giving them money or going to Israel. He said, so I'm happy to take it. I'm not taking their orders. He was very clear on that, apparently. Not taking their orders, but I'm taking their money. So because I want a Nazi party and they want a Nazi party, so that's fine. That was what Lincoln Rockwell said. So I think that with a group like National Action, if they're not somewhere along the line encouraged, created or whatever, poked in that direction, if they weren't there, then the Zionists would have to do that and create something just like it. So I'll say no more than that. I think the vast majority of the people in these organisations are absolutely sincere.
Certainly.
And it's very, very sad to see them pushed into that thoroughly counterproductive corner, whereby they simply neutralise themselves, especially when young people, and there's a very ugly tendency creeping in to various of the younger groups and individuals now involved in the nationalist scene in Britain, certainly, that whereas in the early days of the BNP, the NF and so on, when we were running it in the early 80s, all of the young leadership group, we either had girlfriends, wives, young children. All of the current crop seem to be single males.
They do.
With and they avoid the question of homosexuality, and they get very, very hostile if you talk about the question of demographics and their duty to have children. And it's as simple as that. That the white race in Britain, France, Germany and so on isn't fundamentally going down the tubes because of immigration even. It's going down the tubes because the immigrants are coming into a vast vacuum left by contraception and abortion.
Certainly.
And for someone to say, I'm a nationalist leader, I'm the great hero, but I haven't got time for kids, and especially you see it, particularly from some of the American websites and so on, this ruthless position of not just opposing feminism, but basically taking it from opposing feminism to taking the men's lib, the Milo type thing, and so on. Yeah. It's pure poison.
It is poison.
This is exactly like the neocon push to have us to have all the Goyim fighting all the Muslims.
Certainly.
So it's the same to have because feminism is a cancer, clearly a cultural Marxist poison, deliberately injected into our
women
politics.
aren't the enemy.
But women aren't the enemy. And the minute you start saying that we as men, we're so oppressed, we have to stand up as men. No, you don't have to. You have to stand up as Europeans, as white people, as Christians, but not as men against women. And so, as I say, I'm very, very alarmed to see this developing, because it's another division. It's bad enough to have class divisions, but at least class divisions to an extent are quite often based in some sort of fact, whereby basically it's the rich and the powerful who wanted cheap labour who are responsible for immigration, and it's the working class who suffer from immigration. So to an extent there's a legitimacy for a nationalist party therefore to take a class position. But the minute someone claims to be a nationalist and takes what is basically an anti-woman position, and even, obviously men and women are different, in our heads and so on. But it's a very, very thin line between stating as a fact and then saying, and then sort of taking it over to a contempt level, which is what these people have.
There are a lot of homosexuals, I don't know if you've noticed that, whether in the national scene, especially in the United States, as well as in London. There's a
well, they didn't used to be. They didn't used to be. In the National Front, first of all, when he finally acted, John Tyndall, but then particularly myself, Joe Pearce, Derek Honor and others, we got rid of the whole lot. Quite simple. And it was, indeed. And it was a heterosexual party of young people, and we had kids around. And even though we were only just beginning to sort of learn our way, we had creches at events and things like that.
That's the way it should be. I mean, even, to be honest with you, at the UKIP events, there were children around.
Yeah.
And our British Renaissance lunch, we had 5 children. And I thought it was important to have I have a daughter, and a few of our friends brought their children, and we thought it was a good thing. And people were really happy. Even I spoke at the London Forum, I brought my daughter, and people said it's the first child that's ever been there. Yeah. And a lot of people were really happy about it. They thought it was a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, we're not poisonous people. Why should children be around us?
Yeah, absolutely.
But a lot of some of the speakers at NPI, National Policy Institute, as well as these other events, there's a lot of kind of I don't want to say misogyny, it's a kind of a leftist term, but certainly it feels like it's contempt for women.
Yeah,
it's contempt for women.
So it's certainly how women read it.
It is. It's how I read it too.
So even if it wasn't, it's a simple fact that a movement which is concerned about the future of our children and the white race, which then goes out of its way to do things which annoy women.
And promote homosexuality and the destruction of the traditional family.
It's pretty bloody stupid.
Yeah. It is, certainly, 100%. I mean, quite a few of these homosexuals in the nationalist movement have hijacked the platform to promote the idea that gays can play an integral part of nationalism. But it's not possible, because the key is creating families, children, and growing the country, moving forward. And you can't do that if you're same-sex couples, unless you do it.
You simply can't do it. And it's, again, I mentioned before about how there's this parallel with the neocons and the counter-jihad thing. In each case, the group pushing this twisting away from genuine nationalism has a simple personal self-interest in it, which when the neocons and the Zionists do it with the counter-jihad movement, it's because they don't give a damn about whether Britain's Islamified. They want Greater Israel cleansed of every last Arab. And that's their whole reason for wanting to promote racial mayhem and religious conflict in Europe.
And get us to support the wars.
And get us to support their wars, and then when there's the homosexuals taking genuine grievances of men, there's so many in the BNP and the NF before, so many men who, because they're a man, they couldn't get access to their kids after divorce and so on. They pay, but they don't even see the kids. So there are genuine grievances. But when homosexuals exploit these grievances, and as powerful, serious intellectuals say to young men, women, it's a waste of time and so on, come here.
That's what I think, yeah.
It's about buggery. It's been plain and blunt about it. That's what these bastards are up to, and they need rooting out.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few camps in Britain where they go off on wilderness adventures, and there are no women involved, and they're shooting bows and arrows. We've never seen a bow and arrow go off in Rotherham after the grooming gangs came. You figured at least one arrow had been shot.
One.
But not one. But yet they're out in the woods. Some of these are funded by homosexuals. The whole thing is quite bizarre.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that myself, that none of these men have children. Some of them are in their 30s. They're not 16, they're 29, 30, 31.
Yeah.
Strange.
Something deeply wrong.
Deeply wrong, and I think it's going, there's quite a few don't want to mention them all by their names, but certainly in the United States and in Britain, there are quite a few characters with no children, single, in their 30s, and they are recruiting young men for this kind of macho, a lot of weightlifting, but there's no discussion of women and sexual relations and having children. It's quite strange.
Well, as far as I know, it might be different in the States, but as far as I know, nobody's really talked about this before. So I hope that this section of discussions will go out and will have a real impact. Because I think the minute you realise it, think, that a light comes on, and then you see what's going on, and hopefully it'll also encourage people to understand that if our people are going to have a future, that requires children. Simple as that.
And I mentioned Jonathan Nugent again. He reached out to Jack Donovan, Matthew Tate. I think there's a fella named, can't remember, the guy who runs NPI. Asked them questions. Why don't they have children? Why aren't they married? Why are they always promoting different issues that seem to be leading men down to kind of a incestuous gay relationship? They don't want to answer the questions even. Some of this Jack Donovan character, he actually wrote a book, and in the book he talks about how he has violent sex with other men. And he spoke at some of these nationalist conferences to men who I know quite well who don't get yet that they're being indoctrinated to believing that this is normal lifestyle.
Yes.
There will always be homosexuals in all movements, but they're usually, some of them have beards, some of them are, have even wives, and some of them have their little things behind the scenes. But this is out in the open, saying this is what we should be doing, and they're promoting it. It's very dangerous. I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. There's one more thing on that in terms of sort of where the movement would have to go. That if you're still seriously saying to people, we want to preserve the nations of Western Europe in the teeth, because Eastern Europe has also got the demographic disaster in terms of the death rate and the low birth rate, but they haven't got the immigration that goes with it. When we've got the immigration that goes with it, it's impossible for us to even talk about preserving white nations of Western Europe and Australia, USA and so on, without saying one of the things that has to be done isn't just a massive turnaround of immigration and all the rest of it, but it's a program to turn around the desperately low birth rate so strong that you forget about persecuting homosexuals. It's simply this: everybody who is single and adult, whether male, whether female, for whatever reason they're single, they're going to have to pay a special tax to support those people who are having families. Because if not, there's no one going to be able to look after them, when they're old and doddery and all the rest of it. And that's going to have to be done.
And we have to encourage not just the underclass to have children. We have to unfortunately, the best people are not having children.
Yeah, it's not just a demographic problem. It is also a question of quality.
It is.
And of course, one cannot begin to talk about that. That's a taboo beyond a taboo.
Yeah,
these things have to be dealt with, and you can't say, we'll simply shut the doors, kick them all out, everything will be fine. So the crude national action way, the country will simply die. Certainly the capitalist system will collapse, great, but you can only therefore turn it around if you completely revamp the banking system, so it's not a fiat money, debt-based, etc., etc. So there's revolution upon revolution has to be done, each one of which offends various vested interest groups. But the biggest one of all, like I say, is simply that if we're going to turn around and have enough kids, there's actually got to be ruthless discrimination against those who, for whatever reason, not a matter of Christian morality and all the rest of it, being, homosexual equals bad, for whatever reason people don't have kids, they're going to have to pay for people who can.
Fair redistribution of wealth.
Yeah, otherwise there's not going to be a future.
So not just to the poor black communities where the money goes now, but to the actual communities with
working class, middle class whites, the people who actually pay the taxes, run the hospitals and all the rest of it.
And so their kids can eventually go to university and do well and help bring society forward. It makes perfect sense. Back to the 1930s, fixation on 1930s politics. Do you think people like Theresa May crack down on her efforts because of people like these? Do they feed into what she's trying to accomplish in this country?
I think that very, very clearly the liberal elite, let alone the Zionist subsection of it, can see that the final stage of the destruction of the European nations is a point of great danger to them. And Barbara Specter made this point very, very well, famously now. And so they're desperate to clamp down. And to clamp down on ordinary free speech produces the risk of a shocking backlash. But if you can say we're clamping down on extremist hate, Nazi speech, when, although it's fading to an extent, it's still very strong within the psyche of the ordinary populations of the whole of Europe. that their parents, now grandparents, fought in that war against Nazism and so on. So if they're able to lump resistance to their genocide in as sympathy for a past genocide, then it neutralises, it takes the moral high ground away from the resistance, and it makes it much easier for them to clamp down. So yes, it's drastically counterproductive. Like I say, if they're not doing it, if they weren't doing it, then someone would be paid to do it. That's how useful it is.
I think so. I think some of these people probably are paid to do it anyway. That's just my opinion. Former UKIP parliamentary candidate for Liverpool Riverside, barrister and British Resistance Party leader Joe Chiffers believes that nationalists could face imprisonment for expressing political incorrect opinions, however temperate they are, especially ones critical of organised Jewry. The reason for this is that in terms of inciting so-called racial hatred, it is simply enough now for the prosecution to prove that hatred is likely to be stirred up. The reasonableness of people's actions does not even come to the equation, nor necessarily does the intention of the speaker. That's his interpretation of the actual statute.
Yes, well, having been in 3 trials,
that's why
with precisely that point at question, I'd agree with that completely. We've got in the Race Relations Act, as enshrined in the Public Order Act, Public Order laws, so that it's sufficient, having regard to all circumstances, that hatred is likely to be stirred up. They've come down from a level of proof beyond possibility of doubt down to likelihood. And it's a huge drop. And yes, it enables them to round anybody up they want to, basically.
Like Darren Helm.
Yes, they've still got the problem. If you're doing something which they can deal with at a magistrate's court, the magistrate system in Britain is 1 or 3 state-appointed, in effect, judges who rubber stamp what the police do. If you can get it to a Crown Court where you have a jury, it's a totally different kettle of fish. Oh, it does depend where you have your jury. When I was prosecutor for the Roon in 1998, and one of the things the prosecution actually complained about was a little mock advert.
This is the magazine.
Yes, a little mock advert saying the heading was "Wanted More White Children." So that goes back to what we were discussing before, and it just in a little advert said basically there's not enough white babies being born. So if you want to do something about it, instead of being boring, instead of wearing your jack boots or being a boring git and reading this magazine, go out and cop off. Because it was aimed basically at young people. Yeah. And that was one of the things which the prosecution in 1998 said, well, this is about inciting racial hatred. And barking mad, actually. But because I was on trial in the most liberal part of West London, the jury convicted me, and it was up to the judge then to give me the very lightest possible sentence, which he duly did. Because over the course of a week, I wouldn't say I'd won him round, but I'd given him a very interesting week. Having a black nationalist, Cyrus Akibala, over from the United States to testify for me and so on. And when he turned up and he got into the witness box and they said, well, Mr. Akibala, would you swear on the Bible? No. Oh, do you want to swear on the Quran? No. Do you want to affirm? No. Well, what do you want to do? He said, I want to swear on an Egyptian Book of the Dead. So we had to stop the trial where I sent one of my assistants down to the main bookshop in central London to buy an Egyptian Book of the Dead, so he could swear on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, because in common with other Afro-American nationalists, he was absolutely convinced, genuinely so, that the Egyptians were black. Well, we won't go down that road and disabuse him, but nevertheless, that was the thing. So we had a great time in this week-long trial, and in the end, the judge, after a liberal jury had convicted me, he then gave me the minimum sentence and then suspended it, which is very fortunate. But we spent 2 days in that trial precisely talking about this point, that because it was it's either likely or intended, and the law also says telling the truth is no defence. That's explicit. The truth is no defence. I managed to get in and subsequently in the other trials as well, that actually truth is relevant. It's not a defence, but it's relevant because it goes to your intention. Because if I'm saying something which I know is a lie, it's a very reasonable inference to believe that I'm doing it to try and cause trouble. But if I'm saying it because I believe it to be true, let alone if it is true, then there's a likely influence that I'm not intending to cause trouble. So then we come down to likely, and the likely part carries a lesser sentence than intended. So therefore you can still discuss the issues and the truth. And the minute you then can discuss the issues and the truth with the jury, then you've got a chance of turning the jury. So while we have a jury system offences. Once you get to jury level, if you're in an area, white working class like Leeds, you've got, providing what you said is reasonable, is what they hear down the pub, you've got a reasonable chance of walking. So when the prosecution in the second and third, either the second or the third Leeds free speech trials, which is about my speech in Keighley about the problem of Muslim grooming, and if they'd acted on that in 2004 and dealt with it, instead of trying to jail me and stop the BNP discussing it and so on, then thousands of girls wouldn't have had their lives ruined. But then that's a different issue. But once the prosecution at one point said, yes, we accept in theory you can talk about these things. You could talk about these, for instance, at Oxford University, but when you talk about them in a smoky pub where people have been drinking alcohol, then it can have a different consequence. And they lost the case at that point, and you could see the jury. And I said, well, no, it's not just that, it's the English class thing. I then got up on the witness stand and said, so what you're saying is it's okay for your for you Southerners and so on, and posh people to talk about these issues, but you're saying that just because people up here speak with a working class and northern accent, they're stupid.
And the implication is that they can't control themselves.
Exactly, they can't control themselves. So a silver-tongued agitator like me, come along and wind them up. And that's a disgraceful piece of snobbery. And that was it. So while you've got a jury, you can get away with it. But the minute you go down the crazed Hitler was right type thing, you can believe that if you want, but don't expect a jury to sympathise with you. So what you're doing is you're making it impossible for other people to speak out.
So my question is, how does one now address the role Jews play in mass immigration, cultural Marxism, and all the wars we're in? I mean, how do you address it then? Because obviously the way we're addressing it is incorrect, because it's leading us down a dead-end road.
Well, for a political party, I don't think you should address it.
Really?
Quite simply. I think you simply need to avoid it. I mean, all you need to say is, look, my grandfather fought against that, or great-grandfather, or whatever. It's irrelevant. We're talking about, now we're talking about the problems that ordinary working people are facing, not just in Rotherham, but in every single town in northern England. The same thing was going on at the same level. Simply move away from it like that. On the other hand, those who aren't involved in party political politics, you can't make sense of the neocons' world, and especially their drive for World War III. You can't make sense of it without discussing Talmudic racism, for instance. But there's the point. I think if you say Talmudic rather than Jewish,
but no one knows what that is. Most people don't know what that is.
No, but if either they're hostile. If you say Jewish, they're hostile to you anyway. So a wall comes up.
You say Zionist,
or if you can say Zionist because it isn't actually accurate.
Which is true, but it implies Jews, but it could not. It could be also Christians.
It could be Winston Churchill.
Could be Tommy Robinson.
And it's
he wore the badge.
Yeah, and it certainly isn't Israel Shamir.
Yeah.
So you can say Zionist. I normally try now to say that, because I'm not doing politics, so I normally try to say the two, which is both fair and accurate. That it is Zionism, and then not just Zionism, there is also this problem of this Talmudic racism against others. And you do need to talk about those. And with the internet, it's this totally different beast.
Yeah.
It is very, very important that a defining minority of people get it, understand what's going on, and go digging. That's a very important thing, because if you don't know why we're being pushed into war on behalf of Israel, then you can't trace it back and understand that what, say, Tommy Robinson is doing, when you look at who's paying him, who set the eating up and so on, it's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Zionist operation in New York.